The cold of that winter morning sliced the skin like invisible blades. The mountains of New Mexico lay under a thick white blanket that seemed to hide every secret in the world. In the midst of that frozen silence, a small, trembling voice broke through the air and changed the course of 3 lives. "Mama, I'm so hungry." Ethan Cole pulled his horse to an abrupt stop. In his 35 years, he'd heard all kinds of sounds: the howling of wolves in the night, the rumble of thunder rolling across the plains, the sharp whistle of a bullet grazing past his ear. But never anything like that. That tiny voice, cracked by hunger and cold, pierced through him like a lance. He slowly turned his head toward a cluster of rocks half covered in snow. There, barely visible among the shadows, he spotted 2 figures. A woman sheltering a small child with her body. Their buckskin clothing was torn, and their faces bore the exhaustion of those who had walked for days without rest. They were Apache, and they were alone. Ethan had heard plenty of tales about their kind, how they were fierce, how they were wild. But what he saw before him wasn't a threat. It was a mother doing everything she could to keep her child alive, and in those dark eyes, he saw the same thing he'd seen years ago in his own mother's eyes, when his father died and left them alone against the world. He didn't hesitate. He climbed down from Shadow, his horse black as midnight, and stepped forward with slow, careful steps. The woman immediately placed herself between him and the boy. Her eyes, though weary, still burned with that mix of fear and defiance only mothers possess, ready to defend what they love with their bare hands if they must. "Easy," Ethan said, his voice gentle, both palms raised to show he carried no weapon. "I don't want to hurt you." She didn't answer. She had no reason to trust him. In a world where her people were hunted like animals, where every unfamiliar face might bring death, distrust was the only thing that kept them alive. Ethan stopped a respectful distance away. Slowly, very slowly, he opened his leather satchel and pulled out the last of what he had: a piece of hard bread and a small strip of dried meat. It wasn't much, barely enough for himself. But when he heard the boy's stomach growl, he knew he couldn't keep it. He placed the food on a nearby flat stone and stepped several paces back. "For him," he said simply. The woman looked at him, then at the food, then back again. Inside her, a storm brewed between the instinct to protect and the fear of a trap. But then she felt tiny fingers tug at her dress. "Mama, please." Those words shattered the last wall. Her name was Nita Redhawk. Her grandmother had named her on the day she was born, during the year's first snowfall. She made her choice. Moving slowly, she picked up the bread and meat with trembling hands and returned to her son. The boy, Caleb Redhawk, named for the way his eyes pierced like a hawk in flight, devoured the food with a blend of hunger and relief. Each bite felt like sunlight brushing his soul. Ethan didn't move. He just watched them from a distance, not wanting to break the fragile balance of the moment. "What happened to you?" he asked quietly. Asha hesitated. Spanish wasn't her language, but she understood enough of it thanks to the traders who sometimes passed through their land. "Storm. Very strong," she said, lowering her gaze. "We got separated from our people," Asha Redhawk said in a low voice. "We walked 3 days without food. 3 days." Ethan Cole felt a bitter knot tighten in his throat. 3 days like that? With a child in tow, out in the snow, the wind their only shelter? It was a miracle they were still alive. He looked up. The sky was starting to close in, the wind curling around the bare branches like a warning from far off. "There's an old cabin, abandoned," he murmured. "It's an hour on horseback. We can take shelter there until the storm passes. Asha shook her head firmly, without hesitation. Not go with stranger. Ethan didn't take offense. He lowered his voice slightly, keeping his eyes on the horizon. I understand. But look at the sky. Tonight the cold's going to fall like a knife. Not even a fire will get you through without shelter. Your son, he needs warmth. A roof. He needs to survive. From behind his mother, Caleb Redhawk watched in silence. Unlike Asha, his eyes didn't see a threat in the man. There was something in him he didn't fully understand. But it felt good. He could sense it. Mama, Caleb whispered. He was hungry too, but he gave us his food. Asha looked at her son, then at the man in the dust-covered hat, and finally at the sky that was already starting to growl. There weren't many options. Staying meant surrendering to the ice. Going with the cowboy was an act of faith. But sometimes, in the hardest moments, hope arrives disguised as a stranger. All right, she said, lowering her head in resignation. We'll go. Ethan gave a slight nod and walked over to Shadow, his black horse. The animal snorted loudly, its breath rising in a white cloud that vanished into the wind. Can you walk? He asked Asha. Yes, but he hasn't eaten much at all. Without a word, Ethan gently lifted the boy into his arms. He placed him on Shadow's back, like he was the most delicate thing in the world. Caleb's eyes widened in awe. He had never been on a horse so big. What's his name? He asked, for a moment forgetting the fear, the hunger, and the storm ahead. Shadow, Ethan said, and he's never let anyone fall. For the first time in 3 days, Caleb smiled, and so, beneath a sky promising to unleash all its fury, a lone cowboy, a strong-eyed mother, and a child full of hunger and hope began their journey toward the cabin hidden deep in the woods. None of the three could have imagined how much that encounter would change their lives. But fate already knew, and it had just begun. The path was covered in snow up to their knees. Every step was a battle against the wind that crept into the bones. But Ethan didn't complain. He'd known worse storms, inside and out. Asha walked beside him in silence. She watched him with suspicion. Every move, every gesture. She knew a man's kindness often came with conditions. But her son had already chosen to trust. From atop Shadow, Caleb clung to the horse's mane as if it were wings. His eyes sparkled. He felt something he thought he had lost. Joy. Since his father, Ironhawk, had fallen sick with a wild fever nearly a year ago, he hadn't laughed again. And now, riding that massive animal, something beat differently in his chest. Shadow is really big, he said suddenly. How old is he? Ethan smiled. It was the first time his lips had curved that way in many weeks. 8. I found him when he was a colt, alone, lost in the desert, skinny, scared, just like you today. But there was fire in his eyes. I knew he was going to be special. And you took care of him? Asked Caleb Redhawk, eyes never leaving the horse. Every single day, Ethan Cole replied calmly. I gave him water when he was thirsty, food when he needed it, and I never left him alone when night came. Sometimes that's all someone needs to grow into something great. The boy gently stroked Shadow's neck. The horse gave a soft snort, as if he approved of every word his rider had said. Asha Redhawk listened silently. The cowboy's words swirled through her mind. There was something about this man that didn't match everything she'd been taught. Something she didn't yet have a name for. Why? She asked suddenly, breaking the icy air with her voice. Ethan looked at her, a little taken aback. Why what? Why are you helping us? You don't know us. We're not your kind. You could have kept riding, never looked back. No one would have blamed you." The cowboy stayed quiet for a few seconds. What she asked wasn't small. It deserved an honest answer. 15 years ago, he began, his voice deepening. My father had died. My mother and I were alone. No money, no food. We walked for days looking for help, and all we got was indifference. He paused. The memories hit like gusts of wind. Until one night, when we had no hope left, a man appeared on the road. A stranger. He spoke another language, came from another world. But he saw our pain, and he didn't hesitate. He gave us shelter, food, and something even more important, a second chance. "Who was he?" asked Caleb, fascinated by the story. "I never knew his name," Ethan said. "All I know is he was Apache, like you." The silence that followed was so deep, even the wind seemed to still. Something cracked inside Asha's chest, a small fracture in the wall she had built for so long. "My mother told me something before she died," Ethan continued, his eyes fixed on the fire burning in his memory. She said, "Son, the world will give back what you offer. If you give hate, you'll harvest hate. But if you plant kindness, one day that kindness will come back to you multiplied." He let out a breath. "Today, I'm just giving back what someone gave me, many winters ago." Caleb looked at his mother with wide eyes, full of a kind of understanding that shouldn't fit inside someone so young. "Mama, he's good. I feel it here," he said, touching his chest. Asha didn't answer right away. She stared at the cowboy for a long moment, studying his face closely, as if searching for a crack, a lie, a crooked gesture. But all she found was truth. Simple. Honest. "What's your name?" she finally asked. "Ethan," he said. "Ethan Cole." "I'm Asha Redhawk, and this little warrior is my son, Caleb." Ethan nodded with sincere respect. "Those are beautiful names, full of meaning, full of soul." "All of our names carry meaning," she explained. "They named me Asha because I was born with the first snowfall. Caleb was named because on the day he was born, a hawk flew over our lodge. My grandmother said it was a sign, that he would see what others cannot." Ethan smiled tenderly and looked at the boy. "And what do you see, little hawk?" Caleb furrowed his brow. He thought in silence. "I see that your heart is sad," he finally said. "But I also see that it's a good heart, one that's been through a lot, but didn't turn bad." "That's hard. My mama says pain can turn people into stone, but you didn't. You're like the river, soft on the outside, strong on the inside." Ethan swallowed hard. No man had ever moved him like that, least of all a child. Asha watched him, and for the first time, she believed. "You're like the river, soft on the outside but strong on the inside," Caleb Redhawk said again, his voice clear. Ethan Cole swallowed hard. That boy, with his clear gaze and sharp words, had struck deeper than any punch. Asha Redhawk took in the moment with awe. She had always known her son was special. He had always seen beyond the visible. And if Caleb said that man was good, maybe, just maybe, it was time to start believing. "Look," Ethan said suddenly, raising his arm and pointing ahead. "We're here." Through the trees, white as bone, a wooden cabin appeared. Old, its boards weathered by time, but still standing. The roof held strong. And in that moment, to the eyes of all three, there was no place more beautiful in the world. "It belonged to an old miner," Ethan explained. "He passed years ago and no one claimed the land. I stay here sometimes when I pass through the area." He helped Caleb down from shadow, then led the horse to a small shed where the animal would be safe from the icy wind. "Wait here," he told them calmly. "I'll check inside." He went in. After a few minutes, he came back with a faint smile. "It's clean. There's wood stacked by the fireplace. We can make a fire. We'll be fine." Asha took her son's hand. Together they crossed the threshold. The interior was modest but welcoming. A wooden table with 2 chairs, a cot in the corner, a stone fireplace waiting for the warmth of fire. The silence smelled of dust and old timber. Ethan didn't waste time. He knelt in front of the fireplace and began to light the fire. Within minutes, the flames started to dance, casting warm shadows along the walls. Caleb sat before the flames, eyes wide open, mesmerized by the glow. "Thank you, Ethan," the boy whispered. "Thank you for saving us." The cowboy looked at him with tenderness. "I haven't saved you yet, little one," he replied softly. "I just brought you somewhere safe. But we're going to make it through this storm, together. I promise." Outside, the wind howled like a desperate beast. The night promised to be long. But for the first time in a long while, none of the 3 felt alone. And in a world so cold, that was the greatest gift of all. The fire crackled gently as Ethan prepared a pot with the few ingredients he could find. Withered potatoes, dried carrots, a bit of salted meat he always carried with him. It wasn't a feast, but it was hot. And that night, warmth was worth more than gold. Caleb had already fallen asleep, wrapped in an old blanket Ethan had found inside a chest. His small chest rose and fell with the peace of someone who finally feels safe. Asha watched him from the chair, her eyes full of tenderness and relief. "He sleeps as deeply as his father," she whispered. "When he slept, not even the greatest storms could wake him." Ethan served the soup into 2 wooden bowls. He handed her one. "Was he a good man?" he asked with respect. Asha took it with both hands, as if embracing a memory. "The best I've ever known. His name was Ironhawk. He was the most skilled hunter in our tribe. He could track a deer for days without losing its trail. But it wasn't the hunt he loved most. It was his family. Every night, before bed, he told us stories. Stories of the ancients, of the stars, of the spirits of the forest." Her eyes grew moist. "When the fever came, he fought for 5 days. And 5 nights. But in the end, the spirit of the eagle, the one that had guided him since he was a child, came for him and took him to the sky." Ethan didn't say a word. He just listened. Sometimes, silence is the noblest thing a man can offer. "Since then," murmured Asha Redhawk, her voice barely a sigh, "we've been alone. Our tribe sheltered us, cared for us, but 3 days ago the great storm came. We were separated. Caleb and I took shelter in a cave while the wind roared like a beast. When we came out, there was no trace of anyone." "And you walked toward where you thought was right," Ethan Cole said quietly. Asha nodded, a tear rolling silently down her cheek. "I thought we were going to die. I thought I had failed my son, my husband, everyone." Ethan was about to respond, but something stopped him cold. A sound he knew all too well. Hoofbeats, several. Fast. His body tensed instantly. He brought a finger to his lips to signal silence, and slipped toward the window, moving like a woodland animal. Through a narrow gap, he saw 3 figures on horseback approaching through the trees. Even in the darkness, he could tell they weren't innocent travelers. Their clothes were filthy, their faces lined with scars, and their eyes. those hollow eyes that only belonged to men who had long forgotten what compassion was. Bandits. Ethan turned to Asha and whispered, "Take the boy to the back room. There's a small window. If things go wrong, get out through there and run into the woods. Don't look back." "And you?" she asked, terror in her eyes. "I'll handle it." There was no time to argue. Asha scooped Caleb into her arms. The boy, half asleep, let his head fall onto his mother's shoulder as she disappeared into the darkness at the back of the cabin. Ethan drew a deep breath. He checked his belt. His revolver was there, but using it would be a last resort. 3 against 1 weren't good odds. He needed to think, to use his head. The pounding on the door shattered the silence like thunder rolling off the mountains. "Hey, we know someone's in there. We saw the smoke. Open up or we'll bust it down." Ethan stepped forward with a calm he didn't feel. Inside, his heart was pounding like a war drum. He opened the door slowly. The firelight behind him cast his silhouette in the doorway. "Good evening, gentlemen," he said in a neutral tone. "Can I help you?" The leader was a burly man with a patchy beard and a deep scar running across his forehead. The two with him were leaner, but their eyes burned just as empty. Well, the leader growled. "A lone cowboy in the middle of nowhere. What you hiding in there, friend? Food? Money? Something worth sharing?" Ethan didn't move an inch. "Just some potato soup and a fire to keep from freezing. Nothing that'd interest you, I assure you." The leader let out a dry, unpleasant laugh. "We'll be the judge of that. Step aside. We're going to have a look." "I don't think that's a good idea," Ethan said, voice steady. "And why's that?" "Because I'm not alone," Ethan said with complete conviction. "There are 4 more men out back, deputies from the county sheriff." He paused. His voice lowered half a tone, like he was letting them in on a secret. "We're waiting on a very valuable shipment coming up from Santa Fe. If you come in here, you're going to find more trouble than you can handle." The 3 bandits exchanged looks. Something shifted in their faces. Doubt. The leader narrowed his eyes. "I don't believe you. If there were sheriff's men, they'd have come out already." "You want to find out?" Ethan said, folding his arms. His stance was calm, but inside, fear thudded like a drum. Outside, the wind began to howl stronger, and inside, the fire behind him was the only thing still holding on to the warmth of the living. "Go ahead. Come in, if you want," said Ethan Cole with forced calm. "But I'll warn you, Marshal Boone isn't exactly known for his patience. The last gang that tried to rob one of his shipments, well, let's just say the desert's been keeping their bones ever since." The name was made up, sure, but Ethan spoke it with such confidence, it sounded as real as the snow under his boots. The second bandit, the younger, more nervous one, tugged on the leader's sleeve. "Boss, I don't know. I've heard things about Boone. They say he doesn't hesitate with thieves." "Shut up," the leader growled with irritation, but the seed of doubt was already planted. Ethan saw the opening. He didn't waste it. "Let me give you a tip. There's a town south of here, about half a day on horseback. Small bank, barely guarded, and the sheriff there is 70 years old and half deaf. If you're looking for an easy target, that's a better bet than biting off more than you can chew here." It was a lie, all of it, but he said it so naturally, it came off like first-hand knowledge. The leader stared at him for several long seconds. His eyes flicked from the cowboy's face to the cabin, and back again. Finally, he spat on the ground and took a step back. "You got lucky, cowboy. I'm not in the mood to get my hands dirty tonight." He climbed onto his horse without another word. The other 2 followed in silence. Before vanishing into the darkness, the leader turned his head. "But listen good. If I find out you lied to me, I'll be back. And next time, there won't be any talking." Ethan didn't answer. He just stood there in the doorway, still as stone. He watched until the sound of hooves faded into the distance. Only then did he let his shoulders fall. He closed the door slowly and leaned against it, releasing a long breath that seemed to carry every fear in the world. Asha Redhawk appeared from the rear door, Caleb clinging tightly to her hand. "Did they leave?" she whispered. "They left," Ethan nodded. "For now." Asha looked at him with a mix of awe and something else, something close to respect. "I heard everything. You lied to them, scared them off without firing a single bullet." Ethan shrugged wearily. "My father used to say, 'The right words at the right time are stronger than any weapon.' And tonight, your words saved us," she murmured. Caleb let go of his mother's hand and ran toward Ethan. He hugged him tightly around the legs, as if trying to melt into him. "You're brave," he said, voice trembling. "Like one of the warriors from the stories my dad used to tell." Ethan knelt down, coming face to face with the boy. He looked him straight in the eyes. "No, little one. I'm not brave. I'm just a man with something to protect. And when you have something to care for, you find the strength to do what seems impossible." Outside, the storm kept roaring, but inside the cabin the fire still burned, and 3 hearts were breathing a little easier. The night wasn't over, but they had faced their first trial together. The hours that followed drifted by slowly, like falling snowflakes. Ethan stayed awake, his eyes fixed between the door and the window, while Asha and Caleb tried to rest. But true rest never came. The tension still lingered in the air, like a spirit refusing to leave. Outside, the storm was no longer a threat. It was pure fury. The wind howled like 100 starving wolves. It slammed against the cabin walls with such force that the beams creaked and groaned. The snow was falling so thick that nothing could be seen beyond a few feet. And yet, they were together. And for now, that was enough. Ethan Cole had never seen a storm like that, not even during his worst winters crossing the northern lands. Around midnight, a dry, deep crack echoed above them, like wood crying out at the edge of collapse. He looked up toward the roof and saw the one thing he feared most. One of the main beams was bending under the immense weight of the snow. The wood no longer creaked. It moaned. "The cabin's not going to hold," he murmured to himself, lips tight. Asha Redhawk, who had also heard the sound, stood immediately. Her eyes met Ethan's, and no words were needed. She understood at once. "What do we do?" she asked, voice steady despite the fear. Ethan thought fast. Going out meant facing a blizzard that could freeze them solid. Staying meant risking the roof crashing down on them. There was no good choice. But maybe a possible solution. "I'm going out," he said, slipping on his leather and wool-lined coat. "I'll climb up. If I can clear enough snow, it might hold." "You're crazy," Asha exclaimed. "That storm could kill you." "And if I don't do anything, this'll kill all of us," he answered with a calm he didn't feel, but had to show. "There's no other choice." Caleb, who had woken from the voices, walked over and gripped Ethan's hand tightly. "I don't want you to go," he whispered. "I'm scared." Ethan crouched down in front of him, cupping the boy's small face in his big, rough hands, with a tenderness that softened the cruelty of winter. "Listen to me, little warrior," he said quietly. "Being afraid isn't bad. Fear tells us when something's wrong. But the brave one, the truly brave one, isn't the one who feels no fear. He's the one who acts despite it. Do you understand me?" Caleb nodded, his eyes wet but locked in. "Now I need you to be strong," Ethan continued. "Watch over your mother while I'm gone. Can you do that?" "Yes," the boy replied, more firmly than anyone would expect from someone his age. Ethan stood up. He walked toward the door, but before he could open it, Asha stopped him, placing her hand on his arm. "Ethan," she began, but the words broke before they could form. "What could you possibly say to a man about to risk his life for you and your child, asking nothing in return?" He understood without needing to hear it. He placed his hand over hers and gave it a gentle squeeze. "I'll be back," he promised, looking at her seriously. "I've survived worse than a bit of snow." He opened the door, and the wind rushed in like a wild creature, blowing out several candles and sending the flames in the fireplace into a frantic dance. Ethan crossed the threshold, and the door shut behind him with a dull thud, like the world's heartbeat skipping once. The cold hit him like a slap of ice. In seconds, frost gathered on his eyelashes, and his breath turned to white smoke that the wind snatched away instantly. He could barely see. The roar of the storm thundered in his ears, and every inch of exposed skin stung like needles were piercing him. He stumbled along the side of the cabin. There, he found the old ladder he'd spotted earlier, leaning against the wall. The wood was frozen and slick, but he had no choice. He gripped it with all his strength and began to climb, battling gusts that tried to throw him back down. When he reached the roof, a shaky breath escaped him. Before him, the snow had piled into drifts as high as his waist. It weighed tons. Every minute that passed, it would be harder to return. Asha nodded. "We'll be waiting," was all she said. But in her eyes, for the first time, there was no mistrust, only certainty, complete trust. Ethan mounted Shadow and rode toward town, leaving behind the cabin and the two hearts that now felt like his own. 3 hours later, he returned with his saddlebags full. Bread, rice, meat, new blankets, and a small package wrapped in dark paper. "This is for you," he said, handing it to Caleb. The boy opened it, his eyes shining with excitement. Inside, he found a small wooden horse. But he was already there. And he wasn't going to give up. It was a miracle the cabin had held up as long as it had. Ethan Cole pulled the folding shovel from his belt and started to work. Each shovelful was a fistfight with the wind, which pushed against him relentlessly, forcing him to cling with fingernails and willpower to the slippery rooftop. His hands went numb inside his gloves. His arms burned. The cold bit through his thick clothing and gnawed at his skin. But he didn't stop. He thought of Caleb, asleep by the fire. He thought of Asha, of her steady gaze, of the way she protected her son with a strength that came straight from the heart. He thought of the promise he had made. And that was enough. Minutes, or maybe hours passed. Ethan no longer knew. There was only the same movement. Dig the shovel in, lift the snow, toss it into the void. Again. And again. Until, in the midst of the storm's roar, he heard a different sound. A creak. Not of threat, but of relief. The beam was straightening. He had cleared enough weight. The cabin would hold. With the last bit of strength left in him, he climbed down the ladder. His legs barely supported him. The cold had seeped into his bones and beyond. It didn't even hurt anymore. It was just a frozen silence inside his body. He reached the door, opened it. The warmth inside hit him like a wave of heat. For a moment, he thought he might collapse. But Asha Redhawk was already there. She caught him firmly, helped him walk to the fire, and lowered him onto a blanket on the floor, right in front of the flames. Without wasting a second, she pulled off his soaked gloves and took his frozen hands between hers. She rubbed them gently, with tenderness. "You're frozen," she whispered, her voice barely a thread. I thought you weren't coming back." Ethan tried to smile, but his lips were stiff. "I told you I'd be back," he managed to say, barely audible through shivers. Caleb appeared with the thickest blanket he could find. He wrapped it over the cowboy's shoulders and then sat beside him, pressing up against his side, as if trying to share his little warmth. "Thank you for saving us, again," the boy said, with a solemnity that moved the soul. The hours that followed were silent, but that silence was full, dense with something new. Asha made hot tea from some herbs she found in the cupboard. Ethan drank it slowly, feeling the warmth creep back into his core. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. There was something suspended between the three of them, an invisible thread born of ice, of fear, and of shared survival. When the first ray of dawn slipped through the crack in the window, the storm finally gave in. Ethan walked to the door and looked outside. Everything was blanketed in white. The snow had transformed it all into a new world. The golden morning sky bathed it in a light that felt almost sacred. It was beautiful, in a way that hurt. "I'm going to town," he said, eyes still fixed on the view. "We'll need more supplies and warmer clothes for the two of you." He reached for the small, dark-wrapped package. "This is for you," he said, handing it to Caleb. The boy opened it, eyes shining with joy. Inside was a small wooden horse, carved by hand, painted black, just like Shadow. "It looks just like your horse," Caleb exclaimed, amazed. "The carpenter in town made it," Ethan explained. "I told him about a brave little rider who rode Shadow through a storm, and he wanted to make him a gift." Caleb clutched it to his chest like a treasure. And it was. The boy hugged the little wooden horse so tightly it looked like he was afraid to lose it. Then he ran to Ethan Cole and threw himself into his chest with a force that made the man's soul sway. "It's the best gift I've ever been given," he whispered, voice trembling with emotion. Ethan felt a warmth rising inside him. It wasn't the fire from the hearth. It was something else, something he hadn't felt in a long time. The feeling of belonging to something, even if only for a brief moment. The days that followed were the strangest and the most beautiful Ethan could remember in his life. The cabin, once his silent refuge, now overflowed with laughter, soft morning voices, and the patter of small feet across the old wooden floorboards. Caleb Redhawk became his shadow. He followed him everywhere with that curious look only children have. Children who still believe in everything. He wanted to learn it all: how to brush Shadow, how to tie strong knots, how to read tracks in the snow. Ethan taught him with patience, surprised every day at how quickly the boy picked things up. Asha Redhawk had changed too. The distrust had left her eyes, replaced by a calm that wrapped around everything. Each morning, she prepared breakfast while humming old melodies from her people. Each night, she shared stories by the glow of the fire. Tales of spirits, of stars that guided the way, of sacred animals her ancestors respected like kin. Ethan listened in silence, like someone visiting a world not his own, but honoring it all the same. One afternoon, as the sun painted the sky in strokes of pink and copper, Caleb asked a question that pierced the hearts of all three. "Ethan, don't you have a family?" Asha was about to gently correct him, but Ethan raised his hand with a kind gesture. He didn't mind. "I had one," he replied softly. "My mother was the sweetest woman in the county. She baked bread that filled the whole house with its smell, and she sang while she cooked. My father was strong, fair. He taught me to ride, to work the land, and to always tell the truth." "And what happened to them?" Caleb asked, with that tenderness only those who haven't yet known deep pain can hold. An illness came to town when I was 18. It took many, including them. Ethan lowered his gaze. His voice dimmed slightly. Since then, I've drifted. Never stayed anywhere long enough to put down roots. Why not? Ethan took a moment to answer. I guess because of fear. When you lose the ones you love, there's a part of you that never wants to feel that pain again. It's easier being alone. Safer. Or at least I used to think so. Asha looked at him, eyes wet. She knew that fear. She had lived it. After Ironhawk, her husband, died, she built walls so high even she couldn't see beyond them. But that cowboy, with sad eyes and honest words, he had crossed them without even trying. That night, when Caleb fell asleep with the little wooden horse clutched in his arms, Asha and Ethan remained seated by the fire. The crackling of the flames filled the room with dancing shadows. "My people are looking for me," she said softly. Ethan wasn't surprised. He already knew. Deep down, he had always known. "I know. They won't stop until they find you." "And when they do," she continued, looking at him calmly, "I'll go back with them." Ethan held her gaze. There was no need to argue. "They're my people, my roots. Caleb needs to grow up among his own, learn their songs, know their land, become the man that Ironhawk dreamed he'd be." Ethan nodded, though every word pierced his chest like splinters. "It's the right thing to do," he said, not trying to stop her. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was the heavy, honest silence of two people who understand that not everything the heart wants can stay. And yet, that night, beneath the creaking wooden roof, beside a fire that never stopped burning, the three of them still felt like a family, even if only for a little longer. "Ethan," Asha Redhawk began, her voice barely a whisper. But he stopped her with a soft gesture. "You don't have to say anything. I understand. Your place is with your people. Mine has always been on the road." She reached out and laid her hand over his, with a slight tremble that wasn't from the cold. "I'll never forget what you did for us. Never. And neither will Caleb. I'll tell him stories of the good cowboy who saved us in the heart of the storm." She paused, staring into the fire. "And when he grows up, he'll know there is kindness in every people, in every heart, if you know how to truly see." The next morning, while Ethan was preparing breakfast, Caleb's voice rang out from the window. "Mama, Ethan, riders!" Ethan stepped out quickly, hand near his weapon by instinct. But what he saw eased his heart. 6 Apache riders were approaching through the trees. By the way they rode, their painted faces, the way they carried themselves, they were warriors. Warriors from Asha's tribe. She ran out, waving her arms. At the sight of her, the men quickened their pace. Within minutes, the hoofbeats stopped in front of the cabin. The man leading them looked to be around 50, long braided hair adorned with eagle feathers. His eyes were sharp as ice, but carried no hostility. He dismounted and walked toward Asha. "Niece," he said in a deep voice, thick with relief. "We've been searching for you for days. When the storm scattered us, we feared the worst." "We're safe, Uncle Grey Wolf," she replied, turning her face toward Ethan. "Thanks to this man." All eyes turned to him. Ethan stood at the doorway, still, waiting. The leader studied him for a long moment. His silence was heavy. "You cared for my niece and the child?" he asked, in surprisingly clear Spanish. "I did what any decent man would," Ethan replied humbly. Grey Wolf stepped forward. He stopped just one step from him. For a moment, the air grew tense. The other warriors waited in silence. Then, The old chief placed his right hand on Ethan's chest. "I can feel your spirit," he said softly. "A clean spirit, one that has known pain but hasn't turned hard. The ancestors tell me you are a man of honor." He removed a leather necklace from around his neck. Hanging from it was a bear tooth, adorned with small blue stones. "This necklace has been in my family for 5 generations. It is only given to those we consider true friends of our people. Today, I give it to you." Ethan received it with trembling hands. "I don't know what to say." "Say nothing," Grey Wolf replied. "Your actions have already spoken for you." It was time to go. Asha and Caleb had horses waiting. The warriors had brought blankets and supplies for the journey home. Caleb walked slowly toward Ethan, the little wooden horse clutched tightly to his chest. His eyes brimmed with tears he refused to let fall. "I don't want to go," he whispered. "I want to stay with you." Ethan knelt in front of him, feeling his heart splinter into 1,000 pieces. "Listen to me, little warrior. Your place is with your people. There, you'll learn what it means to be strong, wise, loyal. But no matter where you go, you'll always carry those you love in your heart. And I will carry you in mine." Caleb threw himself into his arms. He hugged him with a force far beyond his size. "When I grow up," he said between sobs, "I'm going to be like you. I'll help people who need it. I'll be kind. I'll be brave. I promise." Ethan held him tightly, not caring who was watching, not caring that the tears ran freely down his face. That day, standing at the edge of goodbye and morning light, a cowboy and a child gave one another something the wind cannot take away: the certainty of having loved, even if only for a little while. And that was everything. "You're already brave, little one. You already are," whispered Ethan Cole, gently brushing the tears from Caleb Redhawk's face. When the boy finally let go of his embrace, Asha Redhawk stepped closer. For a moment they said nothing. They simply looked at one another. And in that look, they said it all. "Thank you. Forgive me. Take care. Don't forget. Always." Finally, Asha broke the silence. "Thank you," she said, voice almost a whisper, "for everything." She leaned in and placed a soft, warm, almost sacred kiss on his cheek. Then she looked at him one last time, as if trying to memorize his face forever. "May the spirits guide your path, Ethan, and may you one day find the peace your heart deserves." Ethan nodded, unable to speak. Emotion closed up his throat. Asha mounted her horse with grace and lifted Caleb in front of her. The boy looked back, raising his hand high. "Goodbye, Ethan. I'll never forget you." "Goodbye, little warrior," he shouted back. "Never forget your promise." And so, under the clear sun of a winter morning, the group of Apaches rode off through the snow, their figures slowly fading into the vastness of the mountains. Ethan watched them until they became shadows, until nothing remained but the wind. He stood alone before the cabin that, for a few days, had been a home. The necklace from Grey Wolf hung over his chest, and in the air, the laughter of a child still lingered. Shadow stepped close and nudged his shoulder with her muzzle. "I know, girl," Ethan whispered, stroking her neck. "I'll miss them too." He looked once more toward the horizon. He knew he'd most likely never see them again, that their paths, by fate or by duty, had diverged. But he also knew something else. He was no longer alone. Out there, in the mountains, there was a mother who would tell stories about him. There was a boy who would grow up with a promise in his heart. And there was a people who would call him friend. And in his own chest, where once there had only been dust and silence, now something new burned. A small flame, but eternal. The flame of hope. Ethan mounted Shadow. He glanced back at the cabin one last time, breathed deep, and rode off. This time he wasn't running from the past. He was riding west, toward new horizons, toward stories yet to be written, with the necklace of an Apache chief on his chest, with the memory of a brave woman in his mind, and with the promise of a little warrior kept forever in his heart.